Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome back to my Philosopher series. I'm Phoenix, and I'm super stoked because today I'm going to talk about the philosopher Saint Augustine, and specifically his book, The Confessions. I'm super stoked to be able to talk about Augustine as part of my Philosopher series. So without further ado, let's dive right in. And I encourage you to check out my other episodes in my Philosopher series for more context, as I think that it would help you be able to follow the train of thought that philosophers in ancient times have taken up to this point to Saint Augustine. Now, there is a lot that I could say about Saint Augustine. There's a lot that I could say in general about his influence on philosophy and his influence on religion. And certainly these are things that cannot be glossed over because they are very much an important part of the tradition. Now, to give a little context, I would say that philosophy has been described as a no man's land. I believe this is attributed to Bertrand Russell. It is a no man's land between science and religion. And this is interesting to think about because it means that there are completely different poles in which people can take whenever they're thinking about philosophy and whenever they're thinking philosophically. You have more scientific-minded philosophers, such as Descartes or Bertrand Russell, and then you have the more religious philosophers, such as Aquinas, as well as Augustine and Saint Anselm and some others. One thing that is amazing is that philosophy is a very wide-ranging field, and there are a lot of different aspects that you can explore in philosophy, and this is something to keep in mind. Now, I will be upfront, I am not as much a fan of the more religious impulses that you find in philosophy, but I think that it is extremely important to cover, and I certainly think that it is a part of the tradition of philosophy, which is why I decided that I was going to cover Augustine. Now, there is a lot that could be said about the distinction between religion and philosophy. As I said, it can go in any direction, and so that's something to keep in mind. But Augustine has been described as a church father, if not the church father, of Christianity as we see it today. And so Augustine definitely has a very specific angle with which he is using. Now, one thing that I find interesting about the structure of the Confessions is that it is very much autobiographical. Now, when we think about the philosophers that we've covered so far in this Philosopher series, such as Epicurus or Lucretius or Plato and Aristotle, you can be poetic in your approach, such as Lucretius or Parmenides. You can also take a more discourse-oriented approach where you're much more argumentative and focused on argument, such as with Epicurus and the Stoics and some other philosophers. Although you could say that Marcus Aurelius was in the autobiographical mode, which would make sense, so it just depends on how you interpret it. But the reason why I find this interesting is because Augustine does mark a little bit of a shift in philosophical thinking by focusing on himself as an infant and talking about his confession, so to speak, with him becoming a Christian and challenging the culture in which he lived in. And one thing that is interesting about this approach is that we haven't really seen an autobiographical approach. Usually things are presented as arguments, but with Augustine, it's very much a personal approach. And so this is something very interesting to keep in mind, that philosophy can be very personal, and that already we're seeing different trends in the way in which philosophy is practiced. Now, I did want to talk a little bit, as I had mentioned before, about the distinction with religion and philosophy. As I said, it's not the most interesting element of philosophy for me, but I find it to be very influential with philosophers because you're very much thinking about first causes, you're very much thinking about the cosmos and about existence and about morality. And so even if a person might be critical of Augustine, because they don't share the same religious impulse, it is like other philosophers like Kierkegaard, where we still want to explore these realms in order to understand different ways of thinking. But the thing is, Augustine was actually very religious in terms of how we think about Christians today, that are practicing today. And the reason why this is important is because he makes a number of claims related to philosophers of the past, related to Greek culture, and related to philosophy itself. And one thing that you discover with Augustine is that he has very specific Christian claims, one of which is the idea that sensuality, such as with sex or even just enjoyment of the physical world, is bad. And you could basically argue that Augustine actually wants to divorce the spirit and the soul from the more physical realm in which we occupy. And this is very much a Christian idea which has been attributed to Plato, or at least Plato beginning this train of thought. And so this is really interesting to think about. So Augustine is practicing philosophy in an interesting sense, even if he is cultivating Christianity through his philosophy to be able to think about Christianity as we see it today. Now, definitely there is also a strong belief in the Bible as the authority, and the Bible as the source in which you gain your knowledge about God and about the world and about morality. And so this certainly cannot be ignored, because the Bible is seen as more authoritative than someone like Plato or Aristotle. And so this is definitely a huge shift in philosophy, and I would even say a rift, because I think this is a very different way of approaching life and a way of discourse. Now, aside from the rejection of sensuality and the defaulting to the authority of the Bible, you also get a rejection of previous philosophers and previous ways of thinking. Augustine is very interesting because he very much thinks that his family is way too, like laid back, that they don't take life seriously enough, that they don't take intellectual studies and the Bible and religion seriously enough. And this is something that sometimes you see in religion, where it's very much a critique of more secular values or of different cultures. And so again, this is something that cannot be avoided whenever thinking about philosophy and whenever thinking about the way in which Augustine has influenced philosophy. But the thing that I was going to say is that part of Augustine's approach comes from this notion of asceticism. So you may remember my discussion of Diogenes, where I was talking about his own asceticism of renouncing the world and not falling for worldly and physical pleasures and doing something else. So very much a sharp contrast to Epicurus. But the reason why this is important is because it is a critique of previous philosophers and previous ways of thinking. And the important element of the ascetic aspect of it is that Augustine himself is very much renouncing the world. He very much does not care about pleasure. He cares about, I would say, his own ascetic views and being able to practice his religion and being able to submit himself to God. And this is something that is very similar to asceticism and to monks, and that we've seen in practice. And so it would make sense with Augustine as a church father to be able to express these beliefs. Now, I'll admit, I struggle with Augustine for a lot of different reasons, one of which is because of his take on human nature. Now, in Calvinism and some strict, very, I would describe almost negative traditions of Christianity, where they're often focused on the elements of society and civilization and humanity that are bad, as I've said, this definitely fits with the idea of Augustine being someone who wants to separate himself from the physical world and become ascetic and renounce the world. But the reason why this is also interesting is because he makes a sweeping claim about human nature, like Calvin and Luther and some of these other church fathers later on in history, that very much think humans are bad. And this is why I struggle with Augustine's philosophy, because I don't think that it is always fair to say that humans are bad, because there is a wide range and spectrum of human behaviors and things that humans can do. And I think that this is important to keep in mind. However, it does seem as though Augustine has influenced the way that some Christians view human nature as being strictly bad, as not enjoying, as not being good with the sensual aspects of things, as not renouncing the world enough, as well as just not being Christian enough and not believing in God enough. And I do struggle with these things, but it is nonetheless a part of Augustine's view. So here's where I come from, because I think I brought up a lot of interesting points philosophically that you can see in the Confessions that I think is important to keep in mind when thinking about the larger history of philosophy. But here's what I would say. I'm very much a kind of science-minded person, someone who believes in rationality and evidence and science itself and empiricism in order to come to my understanding of the world. I also have other impulses that I rely on, such as my creativity and artistic impulses. which would relate to something like poetry or the more creative elements of philosophy, not strict argumentation necessarily. So I have these ways of viewing the world, but religion has always been a little bit outside of my purview because I think that sometimes the views are very strong, and I don't think that they are easy to maintain in life. I don't think they are easy to experience and to convey. And so I find myself as being more a little bit loose in my thinking, and so I'm not sure that Augustine would like my view, because I think he would say that I need to be more dialed in, so to speak, specifically with religion. But I find myself as just kind of being laid back, where I just see things as like open to discovery, as not pushing a view, as not, feeling as though people have to believe certain things in order to be worthy of your time and attention. And as you'll see with this next arc, in which I'll be doing with my Philosopher series, religion does start to come up more because we are in roughly the Middle Ages at this point. And so we're going to start to see the rise of Christianity and the complete change and complete shift away from Greek philosophy. And so all of this is really interesting to think about because there are a lot of different ways of viewing the world. You can take a religious viewpoint where you are more focused on the specific things I've talked about, such as asceticism and specific beliefs and using the Bible as the authority. But I also think that there is another tendency with Greek philosophers to be more scientific and rational, and sometimes even poetic and creative when thinking about their views. And then you could also take an approach, as we will see with the rise of philosophers like Descartes in the modern era, a kind of scientific rationalist approach. And the reason why this is super interesting to me is because we're starting to see the world become much more complicated. There are new ways of thinking, there are new ways of developing thought and philosophy. And the reason why this is incredibly important is because there is a lot left to discover. There is a lot left to explore. And so even if I myself don't describe myself as too much of a religious person, I do think it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of temperaments in philosophy. There's a lot of different ways of living. And I'm not atheistic per se. I define myself as more agnostic in that I'm more just understanding of different views. And I see myself as a little bit cosmopolitan in that way. Because I think there are different ways of viewing the world. And so I think taking all of what Augustine says with a grain of salt is very much important when thinking about philosophy, when thinking about any philosophers and taking a grain of salt with them, that there are various ways in which we can explore the world. And there are different veins that we can take and explore in order to understand the world. And that we don't have to be so strict. And so even if I have my own views, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to be closed off to what other people may say or to what other people may express. Now, I do think that Augustine is a difficult philosopher to wrestle with in general because it's definitely a sharp distinction compared to what we've studied before. But philosophers can be very much emotional and dedicated and involved in their views. And I do think that we have to keep in mind that Augustine was writing at a very specific time when Christianity was starting to take shape and when these views were starting to become more mainstream. And so it's definitely important to keep in mind that Augustine is one way of viewing the world from my perspective, but how he also had a very specific way of influencing religion as we see it today. Now, as a philosopher, I would encourage you to take the arguments with a grain of salt, as I said, and to explore the views as much as you can, and to come up with your own perspective on things. And I think if you can do that, I think you'll be in good shape, and I think there will be a lot that you can learn. And I'm very excited about the philosophers that will be coming up over the next little bit in this new arc. I'm very excited to share the points of these philosophers, because I do think that things are starting to expand, and we're starting to see more and more views begin to proliferate, which makes me very excited. So I'm super stoked to be able to talk about these philosophers, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode of my Philosopher series on St. Augustine, and I encourage you to check it out, to check out his books and some of the philosophers that I've done before in my Philosopher series. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this discussion, and I hope that it got you to think about things in a different way. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.